Welcome, everyone, to Do No Harm. This program addresses business and human rights in transplantation medicine. I'm Ann Zimmerman. I'm a lawyer and bioethicist and chair of the Bioethical Issues Committee of the New York City Bar Association. And on behalf of the International Human Rights and Asian Affairs Committees, I wanted to welcome you all to today's program. We have with us Wayne Jordash. Wayne is a lawyer and director of Global Rights Compliance, a law firm and foundation. His work involves advising on all aspects of accountability and human rights due diligence, human rights investigations, and fact-finding missions throughout the globe. He is an internationally recognized expert in the global network of international tribunals, including the International Criminal Court. We have Eleanor Stevenson. She's an international criminal lawyer and currently works on the defense of the Kosovo Specialist Chambers in The Hague. She also provides advice to NGOs and victim communities in relation to human rights abuses of minority groups in China, and she is a legal consultant with End Transplant Abuse in China as well. And Lara Strangways is the head of business and human rights and a senior legal consultant at Global Rights Compliance. In her role at Global Rights Compliance, she provides advisory services to international organizations, governments, and businesses with a focus on human rights due diligence, corporate accountability, and remediation. So we want to just get started right away. So Wayne, you could take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this webinar, everyone. The focus, as you know, is a legal advisory report and policy guidance that my organization, Global Rights Compliance, compiled, collated, published, which is entitled Do No Harm, Mitigating Human Rights Risks When Interacting with Medical Institutions and Professionals in Transplantation Medicine. Now, this work consists of a legal advisory and a policy guidance. And it's essentially based on about 6 months of work involving an extensive literature review and a range of interviews with practicing transplantation medical professionals, including surgeons, anaesthetists, journal editors, bioethicists, and other experts in the field. And we were trying to get a picture of the way in which the transplant industry dealt with human rights risks. And so the research was extensive. We had conducted these interviews. We conducted also open source research. And we tried to understand what the risks were and how they could be guarded against, whether they were being guarded against, and what the future might look like for the industry. So if you look at the advisory, you'll see the discussion. It's a discussion document. And if you look at the policy guidance, it's a much more practical document, which hopefully sets out how the industry should be acting to protect itself, but more importantly, how it should be acting to respect the human rights within its activities. So let me just try to sum up what we discussed and what we found. The advisory in the first instance, as you'll see, it takes the reader through a journey through the human rights risks in transplantation, which, as I'll discuss in a moment, range from those which are almost understandable and those which are horrific. It then goes on to discuss how organizations might become complicit in those abuses. The third part deals with the responsibility which exists in international law to guard against these types of abuses. I mean, essentially looking at a corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And finally, the advisory looks at what that actually means in practical terms before you can then turn to the policy guidance, which will really take you through step by step on how to protect yourself from these risks in the industry. So let me just quickly, in the next 15 minutes, take you through the advisory and the policy guidance. So first thing, what are the human rights risks in transplantation medicine that we found? They range from, as I say, those which are understandable and which we might term transplant tourism, all the way to the sharper end, the most serious end, which is the forced organ harvesting, which has existed in China for some time and almost certainly still does. Transplant tourism, it's a lovely euphemism, but it's a worrying trend in transplant medicine. The demand for organs far exceeds the availability of organs in voluntary donation systems. And because of this shortage, there are long waiting lists where patients have to wait for months or years before they get an organ. So this drives, of course, a black market for organs where wealthy people pay to travel to less wealthy countries for organs and transplantation surgery. Amazingly, this now accounts for 10% of the world's transplants and has developed into a lucrative industry with an annual revenue ranging between $850 million to $1.7 billion US. To be clear, transplant tourism is considered by the World Health Organization as unethical. Essentially, it undermines the key principles of ethical organ donation and transplantation, and that is voluntary and informed consent, probably the four most important words in this discussion. But that transplant tourism is, of course, just one end of a very serious sliding scale of human rights violations. So the least severe risk of the violation of the principle of consent occurs in something like transplant tourism. The medium risk occurs when you have the sale of organs which are coerced under express economic duress or organized organ trafficking. And then at the top end of the scale, where the most serious risks arise, a state-sanctioned regime where organs are forcibly removed from executed prisoners or prisoners of conscience, as in the People's Republic of China. I don't want to dwell on the forced organ harvesting in China, because that's not what this advisory is just about, but it is worthwhile just pausing for a moment to have a look at what that in fact entails. Since early 2000, there's been concerns about forced organ harvesting in China. You may have come across it in your work and be quite familiar with it. It's, of course, in the global media. And it arose in the transplant industry when China leapt from being a follower in the industry to a leader of transplantation technology. Despite there being no voluntary donation system, within 4 years, China made impressive developments in the field of transplantation, with organ transplantation numbers tripling and surgery expanding from kidney transplants to hearts, lungs, and livers. As a real indication of what was happening, despite in other countries transplants or rather recipients waiting for months, if not years, to receive organs, in China, donors could plan in advance with specific dates for organ availability and a structured approach which was inconsistent with a voluntary system. In 2009, China officially admitted that 2/3 of all organs used in transplantations were removed from death row prisoners, but asserted that the prisoners had consented. However, research illustrated that organ sources had to include non-death row prisoners, including the Falun Gong practitioners, as the execution of death penalty sentences declined since 2000, while the transplantation system continued to grow. Moreover, the expansion of their transplantation system corresponded with the crackdown of China onto Falun Gong practitioners. The more that they were arrested, the more the transplantation industry grew. And so in 2015, under pressure, China announced that the system of organ procurement from executed prisoners would end, and that they would begin to engage in efforts to establish a voluntary organ donation system in line with WHO ethical standards. Of course, the question is, did that occur? And there's not much evidence that it did. If you look at the China Tribunal, which was an independent adjudicative process, a people's tribunal, if you will, which called witnesses, from fact-based witnesses to medical experts. If you look at the findings, they found that forced organ harvesting continued to this day, and beyond that, that it amounted to the commission of crimes against humanity. So that finding was also corroborated by the findings of 8 UN special rapporteurs and 4 UN human rights experts in June of last year, who, having received a range of information, concluded that the forced organ harvesting was likely to be continuing. So, or put differently, that there were, quote, credible indicators of forced organ harvesting. So I paused there to look at that because it's worthwhile just to see the extremities. But of course, it's not just about the extremities. It's about who interacts with the extremities. So the international transplantation societies, such as the Global Transplantation Society, their national counterparts regularly interact with Chinese transplantation professionals as part of annual academic conferences and professional development programs. The same applies to well-known universities and medical schools. Pharmaceutical companies enter into joint ventures with Chinese companies to carry out research and trials into new immunosuppressive drugs, and so on and so forth. Medical journals publish research articles by Chinese medical professionals working in the transplant industry. And yet, few, if any, engage in the type of due diligence and the type of human rights protection that would guard them against contributing to these abuses. And in the advisory, what we then move on to talk about is complicity. And I'm not going to spend a long time talking about complicity. As lawyers, you will understand, of course, the idea of corporate liability for involvement in international crimes. And of course, you'll also be aware of the increasing trend to hold businesses accountable, and how some of those businesses are finding themselves being held to account in extremely damaging national prosecutions and civil cases. Complicity in these abuses is an increasingly targeted area for national and international prosecutors. Now, what is the responsibility of those who work in this industry? Well, the responsibility is to respect human rights. That's the corporate responsibility. And it applies equally within the transplant industry. In the advisory, we look at the responsibility. We look at the soft law framework of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which applies to all businesses in relation to human rights risks. And we also look at how the transplant industry is translating these types of obligations into hard law requirements in various domestic laws in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, France, Belgium, the UK, and increasingly on a broader European and EU level. There are a growing number of protocols and regulations in each of these countries that specifically prescribe obligations and demand adherence and action to respect those obligations. We specifically focused on the dimension of cross-border relationships in organ transplantation because this is a particular risk in the transplant industry. We tried in the advisory, and I hope we succeeded, to really engage with the law, but also to crystallize it into layperson's terms so that those within the profession could understand what their obligations were and what they needed to do to be able to fulfill them. We found or through our research that many within the industry seem to believe that the right approach is to wait for a smoking gun risk, or rather a smoking gun, not even a risk, that they will not act until they see something in front of them which confirms that there is forced organ harvesting or that there is no consent. That is not the obligation which exists in the transplant industry. It's not the obligation which exists in international law for any corporation. Waiting for a smoking gun does not fulfill the obligation to to respect human rights. What is needed is a structured approach, and this is what we discuss in the policy guidance, a structured approach to address those human rights obligations. They can be quickly summed up as follows. One, that each company, each part of the industry within organ transplantation must develop a human rights policy that addresses unethical organ transplantation, organ trafficking, and forced organ harvesting, recognizes the risk and commits itself publicly to managing those risks. And the second is to develop and implement and evaluate what the minimum human rights due diligence process is to be able to do that, to avoid contributing to human rights abuses and complicity in human rights abuses. And the third part of what we really focused on with the policy guidance, especially in bearing in mind some of the extreme risks that exist in the transplant industry, is when a company or when part of the industry should disengage. That is when remediation of risk and harm is just not possible, and the only thing to do is to disengage from that relationship or from those activities. So the aim of the policy guidance is to provide those within the industry the tools by which they can actually fulfill their obligations. Now, let me just stop in a moment, but just to finish with this, there have been developments since the publication of these documents. In fact, it's fair to say that nationally and regionally, there's a lot of movement within the transplant industry, at least in the regulatory sphere. At the beginning of May, last year, the EU Parliament adopted a resolution on the continued reports of forced organ harvesting in China. It was acknowledged that forced organ harvesting in China may amount to crimes against humanity, and they called on relevant institutions in member states to evaluate their collaborations with Chinese institutions in relation to transplant medicine research and training. Countries such as the UK are passing new laws. The UK passed the Health and Care Act, which amends the Human Tissue Act of 2004 and adds extraterritorial offences for commercial dealings in organs carried out in China or other countries. Big challenges, of course, remain. As I said at the beginning and throughout, what we discovered was a real sense of complacency within the industry. Most of the industry does not take action. Most of the industry sits and waits for a smoking gun. Leading bodies and organizations such as the Global Transplantation Society or the UK Royal Colleges of Physicians or Surgeons do not seem to respond to calls for a clear stance on clear risks within the industry. We met with a number of medical stakeholders to talk about these issues, and almost to an organization, we saw that little was in fact being done, and due diligence was not in any way a characteristic of the industry. That is not to say there's no movement at all. As I've just said, there is movement in the legislative sphere. And there's also movement in relation to some of the more responsible parts of the industry. Most recently, the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation updated its statement on transplant ethics and reinstated a full academic boycott of the Society on transplant-related research from China. This is significant. It demonstrates that when this issue is looked at closely, surgeons agree that the risk of forced organ harvesting is too high to just ignore. And this is what we need to encourage: examination, due diligence, and if necessary, disengagement. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions going forward.
Thank you. And I think, Ellie, you're going to speak next. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ellie Stevenson, and I'm a legal consultant at the International Coalition to End Forced Organ Harvesting in China. At the outset, I wanted to thank Anne Zimmerman for inviting me to speak. It's a privilege, and also to be given the opportunity to bring the attention of the advisory to the US. So thank you, Anne, and to all concerned. So the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, it's a registered charity, and it's a coalition of lawyers, academics, ethicists, researchers, human rights advocates, medical professionals, dedicated to ending the appalling practice that's ongoing in China. It's a fantastic organisation to be part of, and it's behind a lot of the recent developments on the issue. I first started working on the issue in 2019 when I was invited by Sir Geoffrey Nice to attend two full weekends, Saturday and Sunday, at a hotel in London at the China Tribunal to hear witness testimonies of survivors of the camps and family members of people that had disappeared. And I can tell you, it was quite shocking to hear the testimonies. I went back to my law firm on the Monday morning and just thought, how can I be here doing this commercial work after learning about all of this that's going on? And it just made my commercial work seem so unimportant. So since then, I've become more deeply involved, and it's been an honour to make the small contribution that I have so far. So I only have a short time, but I'd like to tell you about recent international developments and also tell you how we're tackling the problem. And I'm also here to seek your support in doing that. So as Wayne just touched on, we had the 2022 European Parliament resolution where they said, among other things, they called on the EU and member states to raise organ harvesting in China and to prohibit the export of organ transplantation devices to entities responsible for forced organ harvesting. And they also reminded of any legal ramifications of relationships with medical institutions and professionals who may engage in unethical organ transplantation, organ trafficking, or forced organ harvesting. Very recently and significantly in February this year, the bipartisan Stopped Forced Organ Harvesting Act passed a significant hurdle in US Congress. Representative Chris Smith, his final comments were, people are finally waking up to the brutality of the CCP. We in the United States, in the medical field in particular, must examine our moral complicity in this most heinous of crimes. Then very recently, 9th of March, Republican Senator Tom Cotton and Democrat Senator Chris Coons introduced the bill in the US Senate. So that is going very well. Wayne touched on some UK legislation. We've also got the procurement bill in the UK that I'm working on. We're trying to get an amendment passed, and the purpose of that amendment is to stop UK taxpayers' money being spent on anything in relation to forced organ harvesting. That's also going very well, and we've got the support of 2 very senior lords and some very influential MPs. So we're hopeful about that. Notably, throughout that bill process, there's been no question as to the seriousness of the issue. No one's doubting that it's going on, which used to happen fairly recently, but things have changed. So there's no doubt it's going on, and they've all said we don't doubt as to the scale and how serious it is. The only question for that bill is whether that bill is actually the appropriate place for an amendment like that, and we're doing our best to argue that it is. So there are many other developments, but time is limited. We do have an information sheet for anyone that wants to know about other recent developments. And it's always good to read those because lots is going on and it's quite promising. So in answer to the international calls to action, along came the GRC advisory. A quick personal remark is that Anne mentioned that I had a legal background. And consequently, I'm always slightly skeptical about anything that tries to fix crimes or human rights abuses that's outside the legal regime. But having now been involved with this issue and also having seen and worked within the international sphere and seen the limitations of international justice, I can say that it is an extremely valuable instrument to tackle the issue, and it is a world first framework for medical institutions to work with. The way that we're currently promoting the advisory is that we're doing a joint letter campaign to transplantation societies in lots of different countries. That will extend to hospitals, universities and medical journals later. The first responses from the transplantation societies are that they do support ethical donation and practice in general, but they don't seem to realise that they need policies themselves to change what they're doing, change their activities. And when I say their activities, their scientific conferences that they hold annually where they invite Chinese delegates along and train them all about surgery and organ transplants. So generally their position is that everything's fine and they don't need to do anything. So we're trying to get briefings with them, offering them free of charge briefings and generally taking the stance that we want to help them rather than being aggressive or there being some passive aggressive tones or anything like that. Wayne mentioned the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantations boycott. That was a positive inspiration for everyone. Again, like Wayne said, it's exactly what we need, exactly the right timing. And you know, people and organisations need to disengage when there is no transparency regarding organ transplantation data, and they need, and you know, if they can't be sure that they're not being complicit, they must engage, and that's our message. One point I briefly wanted to raise was that obviously when we speak to medical professionals or institutions and ask them to change their policies, they will inevitably be asking themselves in their capacity as boards of directors, do we actually need to do this? What happens if I don't? Will I be personally held liable? What will happen to the company or institution? We'll get comments like, there's no evidence of us being involved. Of course, we don't intend to harm anyone. And I think we need to go in with the mindset that they want to protect their bottom line and they also care deeply about their reputation. So I think it's important to set out to these companies, institutions or professionals that the GRC advisory does 2 main things. And first of all, it makes them do their due diligence in the first place, and that of course reduces the risk of them being caught up in anything. And secondly, if they do get caught up in forced organ harvesting, which could easily happen to a well-meaning organisation because they have complex supply chains that are wide-reaching across many jurisdictions, they can actually say, well, we had this policy in place and we followed it, and you know, we did everything in our power not to get caught up, and we did. And that way it would be very hard for any prosecutor to say that they had the requisite intention to cause harm, or that they turned a blind eye. So I think that's what we really need to bring home to the organisations. And also in this day and age, they should have these policies in place. It just makes them look like a not a forward-thinking organisation if they don't have these sorts of policies in place. As regards how you can help, we do really want to bring the business and human rights obligations on transplant associated entities to the US. We need to promote it in the US. We need to understand better collaborations that are going on in the US. We know that there are collaborations, but it is very difficult to find out details of those collaborations. We need to apply pressure in the right places. That's the universities, hospitals, journals, transplant associations, and we do appeal to all of you in your respective capacities to help with that. And please contact us if you have proposals or just want to talk about things further. Ideas about what you could do are writing op-eds, generally just talking to people, doing presentations to your professional groups or your students, writing letters to Congress in support of relevant bills, and also media coverage. That's also very important. If you know journalists or you're interested in talking to journalists about covering collaborations or looking into collaborations that might be dodgy, please go ahead, or let us know if you hear about people that are interested. And we have heard that journalists are becoming very increasingly interested in covering organisations, the issue and dodgy collaborations. So in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you very much, everybody. On a personal note, we would like to thank Ramya and Anne. Thank you so much. Since coming to the launch last year, you have been extremely supportive. You've been full of really good ideas about how to progress the issue. And it's people like you that we need to promote the issue in the right places. So thank you so much. And I'm also immensely grateful to Wayne and Lara, as always, for your excellent advisory and support in its promotion. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ellie. We're so pleased to have you with us today. Laura, do you want to go ahead with some questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I would like to echo Ellie's comments and thank you for inviting us here today. Also inviting anyone who's here as a participant to please put your questions in the chat box so that we can hopefully spend the last bit of time that we have in this session to answer them. I think really maybe we'll just start with a few questions that I have regarding the policy, and maybe to you, Wayne. Do you think it's possible for the business and human rights due diligence processes to deter medical professionals from committing crimes against humanity and genocide? Is there a positive global trend overall towards businesses taking responsibility for these types of actions in terms of developing policies? I say businesses, also medical institutions, journals, and all the different stakeholders that we touched on in the advisory and the policy guidance.
Well, let me answer that by I think just reflecting on business and human rights more generally. I think I mean, at the risk of sounding dramatic, I think we're at the beginning of a real revolution. Sounds like a strong word, but I think let's call it a paradigm of holding businesses to account more generally. I think when I started global rights compliance in 2013, it was the discussion around holding businesses to account really was a sort of niche activity amongst certain NGOs who were representing victims, amongst the more responsible of businesses who were keen to get ahead of the game. It wasn't something that businesses were particularly concerned about, and they certainly were not prepared to pay for advice as to how to conduct due diligence and how to design human rights policies and so on. I think fast forward to 2023, and I think the situation's changed significantly. It really has become a conversation at the domestic level, at the regional level, at the international level. And I don't get me wrong. I don't think that in any way enforcement or regulation is where it should be for businesses. I don't think that your average business is going to worry about being dragged into court anytime soon. But I think the risk is there in a way that it wasn't 6-7 years ago. I think there are high-profile cases going through different national courts, whether that's London's and the prosecution of an oil company for alleged involvement in crimes against humanity in South Sudan, or cases going through the French courts. If you are unlucky now as a business, you may find yourself in court facing some very serious charges in a way which you really didn't, you wouldn't 7, 8, 10 years ago. So there's still a long way to go. In the transplant industry, I think there's a huge way to go. I think there's insufficient recognition of the risks, as I discussed, and I think there's a general feel that if you're a sort of an average actor, whether you're a journal editor or let's say you know, an actor in a Western country, you're not going to face any action for involvement with serious human rights abuses through interacting with, for example, the Chinese system. But I think, you know, as I say, I suspect what will happen is that a business will find itself suddenly in the headlight in the transplant industry, and that will change overnight. I think that there are enough organizations, human rights organizations, who are now focusing in on China for a variety of reasons, for the forced organ harvesting to the treatment of the Uyghurs, and so on and so forth. Not to mention their now increasing support for Russia and their growth as a superpower, that I think they're beginning to become an increased a target. And one way to get to China is to go after those who are interacting with them. So I would fully expect in the next few years a case arising from a Western company for interacting with the Chinese forced organ harvesting industry. And I think that will be a shock to everyone, but I think there's a sort of inevitability about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll return to that point in a second about the insufficient focus on the risks and how we can compel those that are not aware of the risks towards action. But I just want to jump on your point quickly.
Oh, sorry. I was going to jump in on that also, just because one of the follow-up questions I think made sense for that, which is really what diligences do, and do you have sample policies for, you know, what a corporate policy might look like?
Lara?
Do we have a sample for what a due diligence process looks like? We do, in terms of the identification of risks and then the prevention and mitigation of risks and remediation at the end of that process is all sits within the policy guidance that Wayne spoke to earlier on this call. And we have actually split out into that in that policy guidance how that is designated to each type of stakeholder. So there should be quite clear guidance, hopefully, but we are also always interested from those to hear from those organizations that perhaps are still struggling to implement that or understand what that means in practice. And that's where we kind of also jump in to advise organizations on how they can implement that in practice.
I just wanted to reiterate that the policy guidance is extremely comprehensive, to the point where certain organisations in certain fields can almost copy and paste the wording into their own policy. It is absolutely excellent. So we would advise people in the industry to read that. Obviously, when you ask them to change their policy, people would immediately think, how would you do that? It would be a huge piece of work, but this is what the policy guidance is, and the advisory is done for you. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. You know, the work involved in designing a human rights policy and beginning the process of due diligence is, you know, there's work involved, of course, but once that work is done and the systems are in place, you know, it's fully expected that an organization should, in most instances, be able to build that expertise in-house. So the management should be seized of the responsibility, and they should learn to integrate that through the organization and continue evaluating those risks with existing relationships and new relationships. But it doesn't have to be overly burdensome after the initial work has been done. And I think that's the mistake that businesses make, is to regard it as a burden rather than as an opportunity to streamline their own organization, bring life and energy and dynamism to their organization, and in doing so protect themselves from risks. You know, if a company conducts due diligence, almost certainly it will not end up in a courtroom, because the ones that do are the ones who just ignore these requirements. They're not if you show any effort to design a human rights policy and to conduct due diligence, that will stand as your solid defense, even if something goes wrong. Nobody's going to take you to court if you try to deal with the risk and take a good faith approach to these issues.
Anne, did you have another question, or would you like me to continue?
I think you should go ahead with the next question. Thanks.
Okay, I'm actually, I just jumped to a question that's been posed live because I think it's quite interesting. Ellie, maybe we can have a chat about that. Is one of the participants says she's a medical doctor and recognizes that there is a willful blindness and likely a complacency amongst health professionals and health systems, as well as prosecutors, because it doesn't happen here sort of problem. And she notes that perhaps strengthening the law, perhaps the bill proposed by Tom Cotton to make consequences more serious and more likely in Western countries, could be a solution, although it sounds like a jurisdiction problem. So it's just interesting maybe whether we can talk about what ETAC's position is on that strengthening the law point and about mandatory reporting, and also what your feelings are on the jurisdictional issues with this issue, considering China is not under ICC jurisdiction.
So as regards China, it's not under ICC jurisdiction. And believe me, we have thought about every mechanism we can to try and prosecute the members of the CCP. We even had a call the other day with Sir Geoffrey Nice and Wayne Jordash about bringing a claim at the ICJ. that's the International Court of Justice, the head of the UN, the head court for UN, and China have even invoked a provision in that, meaning we can't try and bring a claim against them for genocide under that. That then leaves you with universal jurisdiction mechanisms, which is when you bring a claim in your domestic country. For example, if a perpetrator from China flew over to the UK to see their brother or something like that, you could try and get them on UK soil, and domestic court would have jurisdiction to try them. But what happens in those circumstances is you end up getting low ranking officials only, because the more senior ones, and the ones obviously causing the problem, that they've got heads of state immunity. So yes, it's really difficult actually to bring a claim against them personally. And there are Magnitsky sanctions. Questionable how much they're taken seriously, but it is really difficult, and that's why I really stress and support this advisory, because what we're doing is trying to hurt the CCP this way. So you're trying to take away the demand for the organs by stopping tourists traveling, and you're also trying to create pressure on the government a different way. For example, if you stop Chinese surgeons being able to be trained in the UK, stop them coming to universities or conferences, they will then, they're then not in their circle anymore, and they will put pressure on the CCP that way. So they're the ways that we're trying to tackle the issue. As regards laws, you wouldn't think it, but there's not that many laws. But we are trying to do everything by laws as well, but it's difficult, and governments don't want to deal with the issue because they don't know about the issue. They don't know if they create certain laws how it's going to affect everything else. So there's a lot of opposition to it. But yes, of course, we're trying to create all sorts of laws, stopping tourists traveling to countries, making it illegal. Israel has actually made it illegal for insurance companies to pay out to people traveling to get an organ. This new bipartisan bill in the States is creating sanctions on CCP members and stopping them dealing with assets in the US. But there is a long way to go with that. Yes, thank you for the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder whether we can just quickly talk about the mandatory reporting element of the question as well, because it has been that has been quite effective in certain circumstances and in certain jurisdictions, but it's such that it's not present in the US at the moment. Is that right?
I don't think it's present in the US, no. The US bill is great because it mentions forced organ harvesting. That's what's really good about the US, but there's a long way to go with the wording and the drafting. And but there's an exciting directive coming out or in progress in the European Parliament at the moment called the Corporate Sustainability Directive, which I think is in your report, and that is creating mandatory reporting on organisations. They've got to have over a certain turnover. But they've got to provide data that they are doing things correctly. The reason why that's brilliant is because even if they don't cause harm, they still have to do their due diligence. Whereas lots of these other things that we've been talking about, these companies only get in trouble if they cause harm first. But we want it to be the other way around. We just want them to not cause harm in the first place and do their due diligence first.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I wonder, Wayne, whether we can just touch back to the issue about insufficient focus on the risks, if that is the preferred approach that we're taking, and hopefully we demonstrate that through the advisory. What can we do where there is insufficient focus from transplant related professionals on the risks or associated research and training institutes? How can we compel them to take the necessary steps to develop the policy that ensures that whole due diligence process is embedded in the practice of the organization? Is there any recommendations or any advice that you would have for those that are on the call?
Oh, it's a difficult question because you're asking how do you affect change in the human rights world, which is, as Ellie was discussing, and as you've touched upon, is a combination always of different approaches, from litigation to exposure, to reputational risks, to lobbying governments for legislative change, to having these types of webinars with transplant societies and with members of the industry. So it's how long is a piece of string, and how many things do you need to do to change the mindset within the industry. I think what Ellie said about the enforcement side is right. I mean, I confidently predict that there will be a case of some kind which will end up in a courtroom somewhere. But if you're a company or you're a complacent organization within the transplant industry and you've operated without due diligence for many years, you may not see that, or you may see that risk as eminently manageable, of course, until it happens to you, though, of course, and until it happens to an organization close to you. But it you know, that is, I mean, that's the sledgehammer to crack the nut that it's almost certainly needed. But I think the prevention is better than the cure. And I think trying to persuade companies one way or another to engage in due diligence, and I think, you know, the perfection shouldn't be the enemy of good. Company, you know, we need to persuade companies that they can do this without too much trouble, and I think that's possible. So it's not a clear strategy, but I think the problem is serious enough to require a multi-handed approach, and there'll be no quick fixes of this for sure. This is I don't think I've seen an industry where the risks are so significant that is so complacent in the corporate world as I have in the transplant industry. It's quite surprising how almost all actors ignore the risks emanating from China, even though the risks are obvious. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think we have to see it as a multi-dimensional theory of change, if you like.
Just to add to that, it's very a good way, a quick way, the quickest way of implementing change or pressurizing would, of course, be to make an example of somebody or a company like Wayne's talked about. The difficulty with any prosecution is that it's very hard to see what's happening in China because no one can get it and there's no transparency. So that is a huge hurdle. We're far away from that. But even if we did think that someone was doing something, it's really hard to find out what's going on in China at the other end. For example, if a Chinese surgeon is trained in the UK in the UK hospital and we want to sue the UK hospital, we then have to go and show that that Chinese surgeon has gone and performed unethical organ transplants, which is very hard to do. Everybody's terrified in China. Experts won't speak to you. China won't let anybody in. So this is really a marathon, not a race, and we have to just keep plugging away and trying to do everything. Try and get a commission of inquiry or get investigations started so that we can go in and collect the evidence to then bring prosecutions. But it is obviously very difficult.
Yeah, definitely a marathon, not a race. And I think maybe considering the audience here today, perhaps it's a nice thing to tie this session up with is what is the responsibility of lawyers in that case? What what can lawyers do, and those on the call, though there may be other people on this call that have a wider set of skills, but what can lawyers do to effectuate change? Ellie, I'll hand that to you. I know that you touched on it a bit, but it would be great to
Yeah, sure, exactly. Again, it's what lawyers can do, or what bodies of people that are influential can do. They can exert moral pressure by writing and talking. And lawyers obviously know how to do that really well, and how to present things and how to build a case. So it'd be brilliant coming from lawyers. Also to talk to people and see what evidence is coming out. They also, of course, can bring these prosecutions. I could be wrong, but I could see the first type of prosecution would be of a large organization, for example, where you can see a pharmaceutical company selling organ perfusion devices to China. Lawyers can obviously bring the prosecutions. Yeah, I think just like we've said, talking to people, hosting webinars, and using their collective voices.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, some thoughts for everyone to go away with, and I think that was the last of my questions, Anne, so I'll hand back to you, and thank you again.
Okay, I have a couple more questions just for these last few minutes. One is, Wayne alluded to the fact that if you adopt a human rights policy, a human rights due diligence policy, you are kind of acting in good faith. But what I wonder is, if a company were to adopt such a policy but fail to follow it properly, are they at any additional risk? Because it's almost saying, we knew this risk was out there, we made a policy, but we didn't quite live up to the policy. Do you think there's any added risk or anything that just might deter companies from adopting their own policies?
That's a very good question, actually, and one I think that really, to some extent, inhibits companies from starting this journey, not just in the transplant industry, but generally. I think, you know, if you bring in the lawyers, human rights lawyers, and you discuss your risks and discuss what you should be doing, then surely, if we're sued, then that will be exposed. You know, whether, I mean, especially in the US, where there's you know, sort of quite blanket disclosure. But I think that that ignores the fact that the risks are often very obvious, and you know, a company acknowledging those risks by you know, engaging with the issues probably doesn't say or do anything which isn't immediately apparent from. I mean, take China with this. The idea that discussing those risks which arise from interacting with, sorry, that's my dog.
That's okay.
Apologies. You know, the idea that discussing the risks somehow exacerbates or may illuminate or somehow brings you into more trouble, I think is just ignores the fact that these risks are pretty obvious. I think the implementation of due diligence measures, I think, are much more likely to show that you've thought about them and tried to do something about them, and then the litigation risks shifts again, I think, because why take somebody to court who may have a valid defense? Take someone to court who's done nothing. That's how I would operate, at least. And I think actually, if you look at the companies we'd be end up in court on business after causing harm, it's very much along those lines. There's a company in the UK called Lead A, which is the sort of one of the world leading law firms taking companies to court. They choose their cases very carefully, and I've never seen any of their cases where which have been successful where the company has actually taken any steps whatsoever to deal with their risks. So I think that tells us something about who is vulnerable and who is not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we have to wrap it up. We are supposed to be finished by 1. It is 12:59. I want to thank you so much, Wayne, Ellie, and Lara, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And I really want to thank our co-sponsor, Columbia University's Masters of Bioethics program and the New York City Bar Association for hosting this event. Many thanks to all of our attendees. Please reach out to me. My email is ahz5@columbia.edu, and we can make sure people have access to all of these documents, the advisories, the City Bar report, and other resources you might need. So thanks again. It was great to have all of you as panelists. Thanks very much.